Instead of debunking a notion that is lacking in logic or substantive evidence today, I'm going to bring some attention to some good ideas instead. So since my usual intro isn't as fitting, I'll just do a voiceover and say, Dying of the notion. Emphasis on onward to better ideas. The first idea I'd like to bring life to is to increase the number of sex-determinative slots of important government documents from 2, male and female, to 5, male, female, intersex, trans male, and trans female. I was going to do a whole episode on this, making a whole list of every genetic abnormality that can be observed in the human race that leads to ambiguous genitalia, but I started getting bored with it and decided to just instead to bring the conclusions that I reached here, rather than bore you as well with an onslaught of knowledge that would rarely be useful. The TLDR for this episode that almost was is that we should not force people who were born with ambiguous genitalia to choose strictly between a male or strictly female identification on important documents. If there were only male and female slots available for hermaphrodites to choose from, they'd have to either lie, choose the sex that most resembles their gender, or if they're lucky enough to be filling it out in pencil, to simultaneously circle in male and female at the same time, but that would confuse a lot of ignorant people. There are so many conditions that could make one a candidate for considering themselves intersex, but I'll just name a few of them just to let you in on the types of conditions you'd commonly see in the intersex category. There is general hermaphroditism, people with buried penis syndrome, people with undescended testicles, people with large clitori, and there are conditions that have testicular tissue growing in the ovaries, and conditions that have ovarian tissue in the testicles. And there are people who have XXXXY syndrome, and possibly, if they want to, people who have 1 or 2 less X chromosomes, XXY or XXXY, and that's called Klinefelter syndrome. These disorders in sex development do blur the line between male and female, and show the importance of having an intersex slot. But I think also that it shows that there are times when there is not a hard objective fact, even for sex, that one has to be either male or female or intersex. For example, someone with a buried penis may think himself as demasculinized and could, by his own judgment, decide he belongs more in the intersex category than the male category. Or for another example, a woman could have lived a normal female life for 20-some years, and then after a doctor's visit, learned that one of her ovaries has testicular tissue, and choose, after that little bit of extra knowledge and research on her condition, decide that she belongs more in the intersex category more than the female category. The main point for this is that people who are sexually ambiguous can and should be allowed to choose whether or not they want to be socially identified with their biological ambiguity or not. So that's my case for making an intersex slot. And as far as transsexed individuals, I say it this way. If someone is born a man, has a penis, testicles, and XY chromosomes, has multiple sex reassignment surgeries, then has a clitoris, vagina, and boobs, I believe that that is enough of a change to one's sex to merit a new slot away from their birth sex as cis female. And I'd also argue that having XY chromosomes and having no ovaries merit this individual to have a more clear distinction from the normally accepted cis female. The fact that there can be people on both sides of the debate who both have valid points who say, no, he is still a man, or no, she should fully be accepted as a woman, in and of itself prove my case that we need 2 new slots to help identify these types of individuals. And clearly checking this transition in sex on documents could potentially be helpful psychologically to those early on in the transitioning process. In essence, giving those who experience gender dysphoria a sort of preemptive finality to their desired and eventual identity, if they so desire to switch their sex identification early. I understand that there would be some social and cultural backlash in many regards, especially for the trans male and trans female slots, but the more informed you are on a subject, the more respect you can have for differing viewpoints. So the final conclusion for this idea? If you are born and identified as a male from birth, you can be free to choose between male, intersex, and trans female on your documentation. If you are born and identified as female, You can be free to choose between female, intersex, and trans male. And if you are identified as intersex from the get-go, you can conditionally choose between all 5 of the categories depending on the condition of your initial intersex determination. The second idea I'd like to bring life to is to create a new language. And no, I'm not thinking Klingon. Let's think about creating a new language that is easy to learn from any of the common world language and is unambiguous in its word structure. My reasoning for the creation of such a language is not because I hate English, and not because I hate puns, and not because I think any other language already used is significantly better, but because I think that a new, never before heard or made language could be of potential importance within both the political and scientific communities. I put emphasis on these two communities because they are both serious, and saying a few wrong words here or there could start wars or be refused to be accepted as reliable truth in other cultures when they aren't translated correctly. And although the already used languages of the world may be better suited for instances of, let's say, comedy or news outlets to communicate with the common man, in terms of knowledge sharing and international relations, none of the world's languages are optimal. One thing I've considered surrounding this idea is to use any words that have any reasonably close-sounding overlap between the languages to have a close duplicate word be in the new language. For example, let's take the English word ambulance. This word, as it is, can be understood in 6 of the 10 top used languages in the world, and in many more beyond the top 10. In Malay, it is pronounced ambulance. In Spanish and Portuguese, they say ambulancia, or something like that. In French and Bengali, say ambulance. It makes a lot more sense to keep this word, or one of the various pronunciations of it, rather than create a completely new word, or use one of the lesser-known variations. And for another example, in approximately 4 out of 5 languages, mama, mom, oma, meme could be guessed across language barriers what the communicator is trying to portray. Another thing I've considered is to keep the very specific words that have originated from various cultures and have themselves been duplicated and used amongst other languages because those other languages did not have a word for that very specific thing. Kimchi and mukbang is a good example of this from Korea, and curry from India, and tiki from Polynesia. And I think it's safe to say that words like email from English should stay. And that would imply that the base words of electronic and mail should also be retained in the new language to some degree. I think that the general creation of the language should be done with a collaboration of computers and linguistic experts from every language, and translators from every top 10 language to every other top 10 language, and perhaps at least a representative from every spoken language with over 1 million speakers. But we can work out the fine details if people put their minds towards making this notion a reality in the future. Frankly, I believe that the political climate of the world needs some solidarity to it if we aren't going to nuke ourselves into extinction. Collaborating on a new language together will create a new cultural norm for the inhabitants of the planet. It would be a big step in reducing the us versus them mentality that rival countries and rival ideologies currently have against each other. As a speaker of the English language, although I don't have much stake in any culture or group of people from any country other than the USA, plus or minus Dominica, because that's where my wife is from, I can say that if I were to move to another country right now, it would be a heck of a lot easier for me to move to the UK or Australia and incorporate myself to become British or Australian than it would for me to move to Turkmenistan and become Turkmen because of the language barrier. But if a new global language were to be created, it would be a lot easier for people from different countries and cultures to accept immigrants who were to move or even visit there, just on the basis of being able to properly and clearly understand each other in a language we would share in common. And websites like Reddit or some future equivalent wouldn't be limited to having only those who can write in English add to Reddit's collective knowledge, which, although is impressive, would be vastly improved if all of humanity had easier access to have their personal notions readily debunked by pairs of eyes who have perspectives different from their own. We are already there. It could just be taken to the next level. And the future United Nations could come together and create some sort of New World Constitution of sorts in this language. It could potentially help better even out the global distribution of health and wealth by giving the poor and developing nations easier access to medical technologies already developed by wealthier and more progressed nations. And speaking of the thought of global tax dollars, a brief third notion that I would like to bring life to today can be summarized as currency from a hand scan. Now, don't get all up in a tipsy because I said hand scan. It's not the mark of the beast. Hear me out. Why go through all the controversial trouble of inserting a chip under your skin? Why continue having a physical medium to exchange currency that can easily get lost or stolen, like cash, credit cards, checks, or Apple Pay on phones? In conjunction with cryptocurrency on a quantum internet, which is an important feature that may be required to make all of this work, we could just stick out our own hands on a hand scanner. So instead of swiping a credit card, we could let our own living hands have access to our unique and purely imaginary currency that only exists as zeros and ones within banks on the quantum internet. If people don't have one hand, they can use the other. If they don't have both hands, they can use one of their feet. People without both hands and both feet could use one of their unique stubby stubs, which would be really hard to replicate. We probably have a while before this technology's infrastructure becomes readily accessible enough to be used by the general public. But some within business and within school testing has already started for some companies. And funny enough, this technology has already been around since the 1980s. Amazon is really wanting to go forward with this, and although their motivations are more likely than not greedy, it could have many benefits to society. And when transitioning the technology from cards to hands, making biometric bank cards mandatory on cards could be a very useful transitioning technology. And going back to the new precise global language of the future, this language would arguably be the most beneficial to the scientific community, where preciseness of terms and definitions and testing is critical when determining if a tested factor bears significance when put under certain conditions. The more precise the language, the more precise the end scientific discoveries will be, from which the groundwork for future research will be clearly laid out. Granted, this aspect of the language would only be beneficial if the world was in a general state of peace, because otherwise scientists would be encouraged to keep their findings secret from the enemies of the state, which would further slow progress by a general lack of cooperation across the planet. Earthwide cooperation towards attaining knowledge accelerates our species' progress, as long as the competitions stay more game-like than warlike. This emphasis for efficiency and knowledge sharing is also at the core of the fourth notion today, which is having free access to the entirety of scientific literature. Now, I'm not even talking everything, but I'm not saying that everyone should know what the scientists in areas 1 through 51 are studying, but I am saying that independent scientists who by their own initiative submitted papers to journals of scientific literature should have their papers visible to the public for free. Art can be seen for free and bought when it is liked. I suggest that science papers work in a similar manner. Like, the more eyes that can look at a paper, the more likely flaws can be seen. A revision with these flaws in mind can take effect, and a more perfect study could be performed in the future. Knowledge is power, and we the masses are being crippled by the censoring of a bunch of knowledge by either greedy or underpaid scientists. Also, having better access to scientific literature is partly inspired by the fact that I believe that most people are ducking idiots. They have a brain, they just don't use it as well as they could. As an independent information researcher myself, a lot of times whenever I am researching a topic, I cannot get more than an abstract of a scientific paper that would be the most useful. I say that there should be an arbitrary time limit between 5 and 10 years that makes these science papers available for public knowledge consumption, so that those who desire to increase their knowledge, and not be a ducking idiot, can fight their own ignorance with greater peer-reviewed precision. And as I looked online to see if anyone else saw this as an issue, I became aware of Alexandra Elbakian, who in 2011 started a website called Sci-Hub that gives free access to millions of otherwise inaccessible scientific papers. It is a little bit piratey, but at the same time, I respect the efforts. She's basically a modern-day Robin Hood of information. Let it be known that I am neither affirming nor condemning this woman. The fifth and final idea that I have for this video is something that I'm kind of surprised I haven't heard any climate change activists suggest about what I'm going to suggest to you today. So, here's the pitch. Climate change is an issue with 3 major categories of causation: CO2 emissions, methane emissions, and nitrous oxide emissions. In the US, automobiles account for about 30% of our global warming emissions. That's a lot of damage! What if we simply made it illegal to create new cars that use gas, while keeping the old cars in circulation until they die out from either old age or lack of demand? Doing this would not slow down the economy, and it would be considerate to the environment, because although the gas cars would be made illegal, all of the more environmentally friendly alternatives would not be made illegal. So solar-powered cars, electric cars, biofuel from ethanol, and hydrogen-powered cars would all be possible low-emission replacements for the high-emission modes of transportation that we currently use. Or even in the same line of thinking, what if we heavily incentivized factories to switch to solar, wind, water, and other sources of natural energy to produce their goods? Subsidies can be used to level the competitive playing field for the companies who are already using cleaner forms of energy to incentivize, and for the companies who continue to dirty our atmosphere unnecessarily, taxes can be used as punishing motivators. As president of the world, I would pursue these notions and many more like them to fruition. The world needs the type of leadership that can mediate between different groups of people and bring about results on par with these prolific ideas. The type of leadership that would do their best to turn violent conflicts into cordial and peaceful debates. The type of leadership that is planning so far into the future that the result of their own personal future becomes inconsequential by comparison. I am once again going to ask for your financial support. I love that Bernie Sanders meme. Well, I may not become president of the world or president of the United States. Heck, I would be lucky if I became president of whatever think tank company Death of a Notion would eventually evolve into. But no matter what sort of leadership I end up taking on in the future, or even if I just end up being an advisor to such a leader in the future, those sort of dreams start out with the support of people like you. And although my subscriber count was only 29 whenever I wrote out this script and whenever I filmed this video, I thank you either way for the view, as even the views count as support in my eyes. So subscribe if you would like me in your subscription feed, and click on that like button if you would wish to do me a giddy. And the link to my Patreon will be down in the description if you would like to support me in that way as well. Thank you guys again. And until next time, kumbaya, mother duckers.